Hey everybody, today we're talking with Skybound, the company founded by the creator of The Walking Dead, Robert Kirkman. Starting with The Walking Dead, the company has evolved and now represents over 30 comic book titles and creators. The company also licenses these properties to multiple entertainment platforms, including video games. What you'll see in the video coming up are two interviews. The first is with Dan Murray, who is the president of Skybound Interactive, as well as CEO of Skybound Stories, and Ian Howe, who is the CEO of Skybound Games. We'll discuss the various operating companies under Skybound, the overall business strategy, and how IP licensing for games works. The second interview is with Cordy Rierson, who is a VP of production at Skybound, and we'll talk more in depth with respect to how Skybound works with video game licensees. And so with that, let's take it to Dan and Ian right now. Hey everybody, I am here at Skybound with Dan Murray and Ian Howe, and I thought we'd just start by first having you guys introduce yourselves, just very, very quickly, and talk about kind of what you do here at Skybound. Dan?
Sure. So, my name is Dan Murray. I have two roles here now, but I'm president of Skybound Interactive, as well as CEO of a new business venture here at Skybound called Skybound Stories, which means basically I handle all the licensed products that are outbound with different partners, but we're also doing more internal development, what we call co-development actually with different studios around the narrative gaming space.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ian Howe, and I am the CEO of Skybound Games, which is a relatively new entity under the Skybound umbrella, and we are building a video game publishing operation.
And just to get a more high-level picture in terms of Skybound overall, so Dan, you mentioned Skybound Interactive, Skybound Stories, Ian, you mentioned Skybound Games. Are there other sort of operating divisions under Skybound, and what are those different operating divisions working on?
Yeah, well, Skybound's a media company. The vision for Skybound from the beginning was always to build a media company around the creator. Now that creator doesn't have to necessarily just be a writer. It can be a game development company as well. So it's just thinking of where does the inception of an idea come from, and who is the author of that, and then trying to empower that creative idea across multiple mediums. And then the different divisions at Skybound on the game side is just a reflection of that. So if you think of how a games division looks like inside of a big media company, we're not reinventing the wheel there. There's usually a licensing division, there's a publishing division, and then there's a studios division. We have a little bit of a different take on what our studios division will look like, which is sort of what I talked about around Skybound Stories, which is story-based games in general.
Can you tell me a little bit more about, on the game side, in terms of the type of employees and like the size of that business? What does that look like currently?
Sure. There's, because we have three different components, there's some, we do sort of have some staff that crosses over between the different divisions and some that don't.
Right.
And the ones that do are usually related to the production when it comes to managing external parties, and also brand directors when it comes to, again, managing most of the IPs that we're working on with external partners as well. When we think about more of the internal teams that we're building, those are sort of carved out and pretty specific to the games themselves.
Yeah, on my side, a lot of our staff are more, directly commercially facing, so quite a lot of marketing, but also quite a number of operational people as well involved in taking a game over that last 10% of its journey to release. So through submissions to first party, localization, QA, etc. So managing that process, working with our external development partner to manage that process. And then we also have staff that handle our relationships with retailers and distribution partners around the world, but also with digital retail partners as well. So we have really a mixture of commercial and operational staff, but we're really in the early days of building an organisation, so it's going to change and evolve as the company grows.
Yeah. And on the story side, we're starting with a mobile product.
Yeah.
So we're building a team specific to mobile. We're building a team of people that are both from a production standpoint as well as business intelligence, analytics, project management that are very well versed in the mobile ecosystem.
Yeah.
And then obviously with the PC console business, we have other folks that are more versed in that sort of and how those sort of different skill sets fit in between the different categories.
And then you mentioned there's like an IP licensing side of the business, and
Yep.
there's this sort of self-publishing side of this, or co-development side of the business.
Yeah.
Could you talk to me about, on the IP licensing side, and mobile gaming is one of the most competitive industries in the world, and there's been sort of an increasing focus on IP licensing throughout the industry.
Yeah.
But for the people in our audience who may not be familiar with like how to get a premier IP, such as like Skybound kind of manages, could you talk about how that IP licensing side, how does it work?
Sure.
How, in terms of like the type of deal structure, and then how would people even reach out to you to try and license something?
Yeah, so it definitely depends on on where it's coming from and what the IP is. Obviously, we're the house of The Walking Dead, so The Walking Dead is our most well-established commercial IP, and it's also the one that draws the most demand. So it has sort of a different flavor from a deal side, and because of there's a competitive field there, and the resources that we're looking for have to measure up to that, and we have to be fair to all of our partners. We tried to take a pretty comprehensive view with The Walking Dead when it comes to licensing. It started obviously with Telltale, and that was the first licensed game at Skybound, and that turned out to be a pretty good relationship, and a good partnership with
Pretty
Licensor
high
for
bar.
many years, and it's at a pretty high bar.
Yep.
I think the difference there is that, so my background before I came to Skybound is, I was on the game development side. I ran business development worldwide for Foundation 9 Studios, and we made a lot of games. We had about 1,200 people, and we made a lot of licensed games. So when I came in and saw the success that Skybound was having with that relationship with Telltale, that was really the blueprint for how we wanted to approach the conversations from the beginning, which was how do we work more closely on the development side as a licensor, and that comes in many different shapes. Obviously, as a company like ours that's started by a writer, we have a lot of narrative chops, and we've had those, and so that's usually where we lean in the most. That's where it comes to how do you sort of create a story that's unique to the property, and they can be done in many different ways to different types of games that you're creating. Telltale, that relationship was very pure because that's a narrative, story-driven game, which is more closely aligned to a television series than it is a traditional game with lots of different systems. So in that case, Robert and David Alpert, who's the co-founder of Skybound, worked closely with the Telltale folks to introduce a television production model and bring in writers that they knew to the process. And that was somewhat innovative at the time of marrying television production cycles into a game process. But I think that's an example of how the conversation sort of started. There's a mixture of creative and commercial when it comes to something as big as The Walking Dead, because we know that we have to try to we want to find partners that have the resources to be able to deliver exceptional experiences. When we move outside The Walking Dead, we've looked at creative teams, and we've done a lot of different games with different independent studios. Most of our license deals have actually been done directly with the people who are making the content. The exception being with Scopely, when we did The Walking Dead Road to Survival for mobile. We looked at mobile free-to-play in a different view, which is you really need a company that can, basically reach as many users as possible in order to sustain a free-to-play business over time. But even then, with Scopely, they embraced our philosophy of working directly on the creative development side, and they actually empowered us to work with the developer IUGO to try to build a turn-based strategy game into something that has a strong narrative spine to it, so that it felt authentic to the universe.
And just in terms of like how these, I guess 2 questions. In terms of the deal structure, I assume it's typical sort of.
They come in
minimum
different levers.
Okay.
There's usually, and that's I look at deals as they're just levers. There's minimum guarantees, there's advances, sometimes there's platform exclusivities to negotiate around. There's rev shares in the back end. There's production services when we actually try to think about how do we apply more co-development pieces to the equation. But all those things really come out of the creative conversation first.
Right.
So there has to be a strong creative reason to try to build a relationship. And then sometimes it's a strategic one as well, where we see like a new category of gaming emerging, and we're like, look, we'll take more risk here, so the levers change.
Right.
When you look at the more competitive levers, then sometimes the business part of the conversation, it tends to also, weigh more heavily into some of the early discussions.
Got it. And then one of the bigger concerns, like from a licensing perspective, is like around the brand approvals process. How does that typically work here?
Look, we always have a production executive that works closely with the team, that does weekly calls. We try to move away from just, our intention is to move away from just being an approval organization and much more of a partner, where we're working alongside the creation and the development of the game, so that those approval processes, we're always going to have approvals built into any agreement because we have to protect the rights for the creator. So our responsibility as a media company built around creators is to protect that creator,
right.
And to make sure that that we have clear visibility on what's being made with their property. That said, we also try to be very flexible with the studios and developers that we work with. Traditionally, a lot of approval processes coming out of large media organizations. Look, as I mentioned, when I worked at Foundation 9, I saw over and over again a lot of those developers that were part of our team struggled often because they were being micromanaged by third parties, not necessarily the creative entity that built the product in the first place.
Right.
So we're trying to eliminate as much of that middle ground and really have a direct conversations with the teams to try to solve problems, whatever they might be. And then the approvals process, they come in, there's always gates that we know that we need to hit, and those are built into the schedule, into the timeline. And for us, talking about schedules is always usually where every call starts, because everything comes down to blocking and tackling in game development, and things shift constantly, but you're always trying to kind of build dates and try to march towards dates. And so as soon as we can get sort of, the sooner we have visibility into those changes, the better. And so the approval process, hopefully, becomes less of an approval and more of a collaboration.
Anybody trying to create content around a pre-existing universe that was somebody else's creation, if you are not beginning with the intent to collaborate, then you may as well actually go and build something completely new. So the whole point of bringing two creatives together, whether it be a storyteller and a game designer, or a lyricist and a musician, is to create something special together. So I realize that's a two-way street, but I think we always begin with that intent to collaborate.
From my experience, the success always comes down to the people that you're talking to directly on a regular basis, as well as on the business side as on the creative side. It's just as important. Both sides have to sort of be aligned, because video games are really hard to make. And it's a very, as big and as successful as the game industry has become, that only means there's been more and more
That's
risk.
going to be my epitaph.
Yeah,
Video games are very hard to make.
They're super hard to make, and it's a complex endeavor. And every time you go into it, you're trying to iterate a little further and innovate. Sometimes just innovating a touch to create something special and unique that's really hard to do. And so there's a lot of trial and error. And the only way to do that is if you know that the people that you're working alongside have, your best intentions as well as you having theirs. And so we failed. Like there's been moments where, I'd say the thing that has been most exciting about being here is that willingness to try and fail versus just playing it safe.
Right.
And that does sometimes, it does create magic when you get it right, but it also can create a lot of heartache when things don't go well. But I'd say the only times that it really hasn't gone well is when that relationship hasn't quite come to bear, when that real collaboration hasn't really been there, even though people go into it the best intentions.
I was just going to say, despite often best intentions on both sides.
Yeah.
And I think any business relationship is like any relationship. It isn't a constant. It has ups and downs, and sometimes some have more downs than ups, and vice versa. There are partners I've worked with in the past, development partners, publishing partners, business partners who I haven't had success with that I would gladly work with repeatedly. Equally, there are others I've been in business with who I've had enormous success with that I wouldn't jump into business with readily again. So a lot of it is down to the people, but there isn't a direct correlation between best intent and results. However, we feel generally though that by having the right intentions and adding some commercial expertise to that and some creative spark, that is a recipe that more often than not will create something special.
Yeah. And that's just the beginning too.
Yeah.
We're only talking about the development side. We haven't even started talking about the commercialization and the way the games now operate.
Right.
Mobile games, a successful mobile game lasts 5, 6, 7,
10
8,
years.
10 years.
Yeah.
So these games, and games as a service is becoming ubiquitous across the entire industry. I think there'll always be these single-player experiences that exist, but they're more like indie art houses versus the big commercial endeavors are becoming more and more like, an entire business unit unto itself.
Right.
And that really does change the relationship, because then if you're getting into a really successful business that both companies are operating
for the
long haul.
Right.
So. And that's what I mean by you just start to make something good, but wow, even when you get something that's good, it's like getting it to service that game.
I think the best analogy is if you're, if you're planning to be in business with a company through a development cycle of 12 months, most of us can figure out how to make that period work. If you're going to a business relationship knowing that if successful, you're going to be working together for 3 to 5 years.
Or 10.
Or longer, that requires, on both sides, really careful consideration. And I think anyone who's been involved in collaborations of that nature, whether successful or unsuccessful, realise how hard those collaborations are to truly make work. And I think a lot of it is, and a lot of my time is spent thinking about how to make those collaborations effective.
Right.
I'm a firm believer that is the way sometimes, not the only way, it's not the exclusive way to create great games, but we think it's one solid path to making great content.
Yeah.
So in my mind is just trying to facilitate that collaboration and then allow the people who are really going to make the difference the space to do their thing, but also to give them the support so they don't get distracted by other unnecessary things.
And try to get out of their way.
Right.
That's a lot of what we talk about.
And that's, when you talk about staff and people that, we have a kind of a, because we have sort of different parts of the business now, that we have a pretty broad range of people that we employ, to be part of the team. But we don't have a huge staff here at Skybound. We're still as an organization, we're a very lean organization.
Deliberately so.
Yeah, and that's by design, because we tried to build a media company that can be more agile, be more directly connected both to the creative things that we build, but also trying to build direct channels to the consumer. And even from the creative development, there's also the marketing and the communication to the consumer that we're trying to innovate around.
Right.
And a lot of that can only be done by finding really smart people in different categories and getting out of their way and not overloading them with lots of management,
Right.
and process and bureaucracy. We're trying to just stay focused on the things that matter to us, which is both the creative product as well as how to communicate to our fans.
Sounds like, one of the big advantages that you guys have is both like the understanding of the artist given the foundations and the roots of the company, as well as having people that have a long development history such as yourself, Dan. But not to linger too much longer on IP licensing, but one final question around what I think is potentially one of the biggest problems or conflicts that arise between licensees and licensors, but that's not often talked about a lot, is around this notion about, kind of having, you mentioned dates before, but whether it's dates or some kind of revenue forecast or profit forecast. And when you're working with a development team or a studio and those dates aren't hit or those revenue targets aren't hit, like how do you manage that conflict, or how do you approach thinking about some of those issues?
Well, I mean, after we cry a bit and trick ourselves into a stupor?
Yeah.
No, I mean, look, it's a great point, because it's never easy when you're dealing with projections and business and the future business of where you're trying to go.
Right.
Both we at Skybound, we set projections around the businesses and the partners that we have, but we know that our partners are doing the same. And when things do change, as they almost unequivocally do, we're always, moving targets in that direction. I don't have an easy, direct answer to that, other than I think it does come down to the same thing, which is you have to be able to communicate with your partners and trying to eliminate surprise.
Right.
Is the biggest challenge. Like, if you're not surprised, then it's usually, it can be painful, but it's usually not a problem.
Right.
And that comes down to the visibility, not only on creative development, but on the health of each other's business.
And that probably comes down to the relationship, per your point.
I had a real world example of this last week.
Okay.
I was talking to a development partner that we're working with at the moment, and they expressed some concern about a particular issue. And I read between the lines, as often is the case as you have to do with business. You feel like maybe you're not getting the full story, so you go away and you maybe investigate a little further. And long story short, it turned out, actually they were being completely transparent, which is completely the spirit of the relationship we have with this partner, and they were actually not raising an alarm bell. They were just highlighting something that had been a mild concern for them, and they wanted us to be aware of it, so we were forewarned and potentially forearmed in the case that something came of it. And so I think it does come down to, there is a great example of a partner being a great partner, because they're communicating clearly. They're able then to keep their partner informed, and then everybody is then prepared to be able to deal with the problem together should it materialise. And I think, honestly, that's really the challenge, is really not to get to that other point, is not to get to the point where you're so far in that nobody can really, there is no good decision, it's just a choice between bad decisions. So the goal and the intent is to take maybe a little longer up front in the getting to know you phase, a little bit longer in the how are we going to do this phase, and then really approach it in a much more methodical manner and say, between the two of us, this isn't all going to go smoothly. How are we going to approach this when it, what is our appetite for risk? What is our appetite for flex? Everybody then knows what the other party can do, and obviously those things change over the course of the development. And therein lies the problem. If you're in a 3-year development cycle, so many things can happen in terms of macroeconomics, microeconomics.
The whole market can shift.
So it is, as again, anyone who's been in the industry a while knows how challenging it is. However, we've both been doing this a long, long time, and we've navigated the space and will continue to do so. The great thing is you keep learning, you keep applying new techniques and there's new learnings in every project that you do, and for me, that constant challenge of having to adapt to a moving market is what keeps this market fresh and interesting. And I think it allows as well us to take a fresh approach to content, because the business is moving at such a pace. The content side of it also is kind of moving at a pace,
right.
And hopefully that means that the content we're delivering is far more relevant than maybe companies who haven't got such a progressive approach.
Yeah, and I mean, just to that point, like dates with licensing, especially when you have an IP that has multiple partners and you have to navigate windows. Right. I mean, The Walking Dead, the challenge often with The Walking Dead is just literally trying to give every partner their fair due when it comes to marketing, right. And creating those windows. And when those things shift around, it's not necessarily affecting us, but it's affecting one of our other partners. And right. So we not only we have to be transparent with each other, but we have to also be transparent with the fact that, hey, look, you have to respect what other people are doing over here, because right. They're just like you, and now you're yes. having a negative impact. And so oftentimes that's the trickiest thing. But what we tried to do in that regard is try to bring those different partners together. Right. I felt like that was the best solution, and we've had some great success now of actually brokering the conversations between different partners who in the past a licensor would be very actively engaged in preventing those conversations. I don't think that's the right way to go. I think you should be transparent with your partners, and that includes being transparent with the other products. Yeah. And ultimately, if you bring those teams together, they're going to figure out different business solutions that we couldn't figure out that will only benefit us. Right. Because really, at the end of the day, it's about the consumer, and it doesn't really matter what we're doing is if the fan's not being served in the right way, and the best way to serve the fan base is to create more connectivity between the different partners that we have. It doesn't mean we have to actually make the games connect creatively, but we can create different opportunities for the consumer to be rewarded for the fact that they're just a Walking Dead fan, right. And they like playing multiple Walking Dead games. Let's make sure that our partners recognize that and take advantage of that, and then everybody wins.
Right. And then just speaking, kind of shifting gears to the more interesting side of the business, this kind of more self-publishing side of the business. How are you guys thinking about this in terms of the type of games you guys want to make, the size of the slate, whether you're going to do internal development versus external third-party development? If you can.
So it's a little bit different between our two businesses, because I'll speak first, but just to sort of frame the conversation. What I'm doing on stories is very specific to a genre, which is story-based games, where the story is paramount to the experience and the gameplay is sort of there to support it. Right? So that's much more like what a Telltale game had done, but we're looking at ways to deliver those types of experiences across all platforms and different ways to do that with different teams. Ian's thing is much more of a portfolio play around all kinds of other games, because there's lots of different genres to build, and so his is a little bit more wide open.
Yeah, so it's basically everything but the narrative sector. So we talked obviously at considerable length during the fallout from the Telltale closure, and clearly I think the first thing to say is we're kind of both big fans of that genre in particular. I certainly grew up playing all the classic LucasArts games, and they were, getting to work on some of those games a few years ago as well. Things like Grim Fandango and Day of the Tentacle and Full Throttle and Monkey Island. Games like that were just, for me, such a huge part of my gaming heritage. So being able to kind of get involved in this narrative space was super interesting for me. But Dan had already kind of made some moves in that space. We talked at length about how we were going to approach this overall. And I think we felt that actually, if we're going to really take control and really start building things in-house, we're a company that tells stories. So if that's anywhere we're going to start, it's probably there. So I think what we've kind of decided is that stories will be, because that's where that is going to live, and my side of the business is going to focus kind of on everything else. In terms of what we're going to build, what we're building, what we're doing, that is yet kind of be to disclose. We're kind of talking and working on a number of different projects at the moment. We have a number of games still slated for release this year, but everything we've been working on to date has been pre-existing content that was developed by somebody else. We have a few things lined up coming. We have Death's Gambit coming out at the end of June on PS4. We have our Bing Dog Collector's Editions coming out at the end of the year. We have our Walking Dead Definitive Edition coming out in September, and we have also Skullgirls on Switch and Xbox One coming later in the year. And I'm missing one, so I'm completely blanking on the other game. Gang Beasts. I can't tell you when Gang Beasts is coming because I don't have a definitive date on that one yet. So
you better love me some Gang Beasts then.
Yeah, you can cut that together and make a release schedule out of it, maybe. So yeah, beyond that, we haven't announced anything yet. We have again a number of projects that we're looking at, but ultimately my philosophy has been that we have two things here. We have a huge, rich IP catalogue, and I look at that very much as a catalogue of characters and universes, and really that's the bedrock of most great video games. It's the bedrock of most great movies, it's the bedrock of most great TV shows, most great books. So I think I start with an unfair advantage in that regard because we've got this world to delve into with no corporate mandate that this has to be the next X, or no corporate mandate that we must make a game around this. It's really about what gets us all excited. So the most rewarding thing for me is going to meet with a game developer and they say, oh, we love, and they'll inevitably mention one of our stories that started in a comic, and they will be a huge passionate fan and know far more about it than I ever will. And then they'll say, we have a game we've always wanted to make. And that's kind of what I want to hear, and I know on the licensing side that was always the case. So in the past that would have been a licensing discussion. Now it becomes a collaboration discussion where we can bring expertise, financing, distribution muscle, and one of the other unfair advantages that we hold, we think, is audience. Is we have so many people who we engage with on a daily basis across many other areas of media, most of whom are a direct crossover to a gaming audience. So we feel that in terms of the projects that we're going to build, we start with that huge IP potential, huge audience potential. If we can then find great teams who've got a track record of making fantastic product, fantastic games, we feel that those are the three pillars that really enable us to deliver something very, very special. And so I think the philosophy right at this moment is anything that we do from a development side is going to be very considered. We're going to take our time, and we're going to make sure the things that we deliver are really of the highest standards and are doing things that are very interesting, and they do them well. I don't think we're interested in pumping out 6 or 7 games a year around various different Skybound IPs. I don't think, whilst I'm involved, that's not going to happen. That's not what we're here to do. So it's really more about finding projects that we get super excited about, that the creators get super excited about. So if it's one of Robert's creations, we want to make sure this is something that he would want to play. He's a gamer. Is he going to want to play this? Is he going to get excited about it? Or if it's one of our other hundreds of creators that we work with, that's a key component for us. And if they're not excited about it, then that normally is a very good sign that project's not going anywhere, and probably shouldn't go anywhere.
Okay. One final question for me. It sounds like you guys are doing a lot of great things here at Skybound. I'm definitely a fan. But in terms of how the organization started, the relationship with Robert Kirkman, could you walk me back to how did this whole thing start?
Skybound started, is it 8 years? I think it's almost 8 years now. But it really started between the relationship of David Albert and Robert Kirkman. David ran a management production company here in Hollywood called Circle of Confusion. and he was one of the first to sort of really look at Comic-Con as a way to find the next big creator. And, he, at that point, Circle also represented the Wachowskis, and so the seeds had been planted around the Matrix. At the same time, I was working at Foundation 9 with a guy by the name of John Goldman, and that was a video game company that had, basically gone out and raised some money to acquire a lot of studios back in the early 2000s. And one of the first acquisitions was Shiny Entertainment, which built those early Matrix games. Yeah. So the connection between David and John had been established, and there was already an interest in trying to, at Foundation 9, part of the strategy was to look at video games as the lead IP. And we did a couple versions of that, where one of them specifically was called Death Jr., and David at that point had, in his clientele, he had brought in Gary Whitta to write the comic books. And then we made merchandise and everything out of it. We made a video game with Konami. The game never quite reached its commercial success to justify a television show, but that was the idea. And so it goes back, this relationship in Skybound, some of those seeds of that kind of go back to the early 2000s. But fast forward, a few years after that relationship had started, and obviously David having met with Robert, that became a different conversation, and Robert, with The Walking Dead, they went out and were able to basically go into the marketplace and get a television deal set up. But yet they were able to still retain the rights around the comic book for Robert. Right. That was super important to Robert and to David, obviously, to make sure that the creator's rights were protected, because the comic book at that point was very successful on its own. And so they started basically making T-shirts. They had a desk in Circle of Confusion with a couple employees. Sean Kirkham, I think, was the first employee, and a couple other folks. A guy named Cine Grace was there, I believe, on the editorial side, making some more comic books. So they just started making more comic books and some T-shirts and going out to Comic-Con and selling more stuff. And right around that time, because the show hadn't come out yet, Telltale had done some deals around licensing, and they had gone to Universal and done Back to the Future and Jurassic Park and Law & Order, because they were trying to build their narrative game studio, take it to the next level commercially. And they didn't quite find the commercial success they were hoping for with those licenses, so they decided to look at comics as something that might be more native to their consumer base. And so they identified The Walking Dead as a comic book first. And that's where the conversation started. They approached David and Robert and had an idea to do a new story inside Robert's comic book universe. And then obviously development takes a little while. Guess what? The television show came out in the middle of all that, and everything sort of aligned perfectly between Skybound, Telltale, and AMC, where the thing became this global hit, not just as a TV show, but obviously the video game became sort of the iconic licensed video game in the industry at the time, and it was a big commercial success, and that kind of really obviously fueled Skybound's growth. And Skybound at that point, David had this, and Robert really had this idea to expand this company across multiple categories. And then John Goldman came into the picture. He brought me in to help them build the games division, but there was already these business units were being set up around that time to, obviously, The Walking Dead, because it became so big, that helped us to build real businesses. Right. And so that was really the formation of the company. And a lot of the central themes that were born out of that initial conversation that happened back in the early 2000s, which was how do you build a company around creators and keep that creative voice intact? How do you give transparency to the business, to creators, not just financially, but to all the creative decisions that are being made? How do you empower people in different categories who have experience to do what they do well and get out of their way and take risks and be able to fail? And then finally, really and this is what's really driving the company today, is how do you connect that creator directly to the consumer? Right. And that connectivity is, we just have found ourselves kind of in an interesting place where the entire media industry has been kind of flipped on its head in that regard, where you have all these channels like this one to talk directly to people, and those become powerful marketing tools, but they're marketing tools because they're not really marketing. They're pieces of content that people are interested in engaging with. And to us, that's really the recipe for how we're trying to build this connected tissue.
Awesome. All right, well, there you have it with Dan and Ian. Thank you very much for your time, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hey everybody, I'm now here with Cordy Ryerson. Cordy, could you tell us a little bit about your role here at Skybound and kind of your scope of responsibilities, what you do?
Hey, sure. I have recently joined Skybound. I joined in December as the Vice President of Production, and some of the elements that I oversee are our publishing efforts, where we're doing game development with external developers, as well as licensing IP and working with developers who are interested in taking that IP out into the market, and stories and narrative.
And can you maybe talk a little bit more specifically in terms of whether it's for an IP licensed game or for a self-published game that you're working on with an external developer? Could you walk us through your involvement from whether it's from the initial concept through pre-production to production, when and how do you typically get involved on both sides, both from the IP licensing side and then from the self-publishing side?
I think the main place that it starts on for both, no matter what you're doing, is with the relationships. So, building those relationships with other industry experts, whether they be developers or management companies or people interested in taking an IP forward or publishing a title. So my role begins with developing that relationship, vetting each other, really understanding, how do we suit each other? How are we going to go through trials and tribulations that often arise in production, whether that be creative alignment or budget or schedules, and just really looking to have an honest and transparent dialogue with our partners to move forward in any position. And then of course from there it goes from soup to nuts, from initial contracts to approvals to submissions to release.
Okay, and then what do you typically look for from on the external development side? When you are looking at different developers to build a game, I guess first question, does the concept originate from the developer side or from your side? And then when you're evaluating a studio, what do you typically look for?
So concept will usually initiate on the other side.
Okay.
When it comes to IP, we're really looking for strong creative partners who we believe can deliver and fulfill against the promise of the IP, and really showcase what the IP is meant to us here at Skybound through whatever medium or property it is being released on. From a publishing aspect, sometimes that involves other people bringing their IPs to us. And for there, we're looking for that creative passion behind their own ideas, their ability to execute, their common alignment on the mystical word quality, and kind of what quality means across the board,
right.
And their ability to deliver on that.
And for that last part, in terms of the common vision on quality, how is that typically communicated? Do you have a set of emulation targets? Do you, are there specific documents or things how is that? How do you communicate that message?
Well, I think so. I love to start. I have a couple of different things that I've learned over the course of my time. I really love to start, regardless of whether it's an IP, whether we generate in-house or outside, is starting with a one-line concept.
Okay.
Having a way that you can describe a product in 5 words or less, one sentence, that everybody can galvanize and understand. So if I give you the sentence of something, then you should be able to immediately grok what that kind of content is about. Below that are the underlying principles, those core principles, whether there be 3, 5, 7, that really are the guiding principles for the title itself. So every day, no matter what role you're playing on the title, when you come in, You understand what the one-line concept is. You understand what the core principles are that are guiding it. And you can ask yourself if what you're doing is contributing to one of those factors. If it's not contributing to one of those factors, that's a great place to pause and ask yourself, have you climbed into a vortex and gone off on a different path? And then if you have, is it something that really should be considered given kind of our evolution and our fast-paced environment? Maybe it is something that we need to consider and go back and revisit. And that's where it's really good to have a process of alignment, always coming together and making sure that we're aligned at each phase of development going forward. And with that comes, design documents, art documents, concepts, debriefs. And a lot of that, I think, back in the day, particularly with game development, lots of early milestones were front-loaded with piles of documentation, and there used to kind of be a joke in the industry, which is like, how much does your game design document weigh? And if it weighed, 5 pounds, it's like, you're good. You wrote so much, there's no way they could possibly comprehend it. But I think those days are gone now, especially with the tools and technology that we have.
Yeah.
I'd much rather see a briefing or a concept that just helps people get things quickly and then move right into a rapid prototyping, because words can be misconstrued on paper and interpreted differently, and it's really when you get into that rapid iteration of prototyping phase that you understand if what you have is special and how it's going to form and come together, and that's really where feedback and alignment happen.
And then when you are working with, for example, an external development studio on a self-published title, how involved do you get in terms of the development, process or the development team? Is there, are you doing weekly calls? Are you traveling on site and really getting ingrained, or are you just checking builds? If you could kind of talk about what that relationship looks like and how you do kind of your checks on quality, that'd be great to hear.
Okay, well, that kind of goes back to earlier we were talking about developing relationships.
Yep.
People are different, and
Yep.
each relationship is unique. I definitely prefer to be transparent as possible and work alongside the teams. So really work with them as a partner instead of a kind of publisher-developer relationship or just like licensee-licensor relationship.
Yeah.
I am invested in the product as well. And so being that kind of partner that rides along the side of is much more opportunity for both parties to yield the best product for it, because we figure out ways that we can help each other along the way. So in a normal production process, definitely do weekly calls with all parties. Visits as well, usually monthly visits.
Okay.
Whenever there is software executables, definitely sit down and play those software executables. Take the time to read through anything that they've constructed and put together.
Right.
And it's really about knocking down the blockers, right? So as you go through production along the way, something that you thought would work doesn't work. And when we hit those, being able to problem solve together to come up with the best solution is something that is pivotal to the production process.
Got it. Then in terms of the industry overall, we've seen a lot of IP sort of licensing types of organizations kind of, do what you guys are doing here at Skybound, which is moving more strongly into self-publishing. And, but we've seen kind of, different organizations do different things. So Disney's kind of pulling back where they're kind of shifting from self-publishing to just doing licensing. NBC Universal is going the opposite direction. Can you talk to me about, some of the trade-offs from an IP licensor perspective? And then what do you think are trends for IP licensing entities with respect to, whether they go more strongly into self-publishing or not?
So we'll just we'll work our way backwards.
Sure,
if that
okay.
works for you.
Yeah.
So we'll start with the trending of the self-publishing. I think with technology and with platforms that are accessible now, self-publishing is going to continue to be a trend. There are so many ways that people can do that,
Right.
that it makes sense. It makes sense, especially if you're a small developer or independent developer. The affordability to push your content out on platforms and have people pick that up and become fans is much more accessible than it was 10 years ago. When I think about IP and which way it's trending, and you talked about Disney and Universal. It's a catch-22, right? I've seen both sides of the coin. Both sides of the coin being that I've been involved in products where the IP holder is very much involved, and from a licensing perspective. And sometimes they get very involved in verticals that they don't truly understand, and that can cause a lot of delays and problems. It's really being able to sit back and realize that everybody is coming with the best interest in mind.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's just adding in layers of education and patience to avoid those. Like, you need to be able to sell in your ideas for the type of product that you're making. For us here at Skybound, and I think the way that NBC Universal is, we understand we have experts across all verticals of entertainment that are experts in their fields, which enable us to dive in and have that closer partnership. So to be more involved and help cultivate the title as opposed to just being the license holder.
Got it. And for people in the audience who are looking at Skybound and are potentially fans of the company or interested in working here, could you talk a little bit about some of the types of people you're looking to hire and what kind of skills they need to be able to be successful here at Skybound?
So Skybound is an amazing is a pretty amazing company considering its size and all the different verticals that it runs.
Right.
I think the types of things that we look for here that I've seen are agility, passion for the content, passion for the IP, a strong sense of commitment to the creator. Mm-hmm. We are a creator-centric company,
right,
and it is about fostering that creative environment and moving that out across the entertainment verticals. And it's something that I really appreciate here. It's not, it is a business at the end of the day, but it's not just always about the bottom line. It is about understanding that all of this content, we look at things like Endgame. Endgame started from a comic book series, and it was that creator and that creator's content that enabled this universe and for everybody to benefit from that universe, from fans and companies alike. And I think we share that kind of same philosophy of making sure that the creator's content is protected,
right,
but also helping that flourish and expand across all the different verticals.
Got it. So I just have one last question for you. So, Corey, you're relatively new here, but in your time here, what have you enjoyed most about working here at Skybound?
Two things.
Okay.
The people.
Yeah.
So it's a very diverse, different group of people, all with different kind of expertise and paths and backgrounds. I feel that that's a constant way to learn and update yourself and have people share their stories along the way. The other is the context switching. My role is different. Every day that I come in, I'm doing something different from hour to hour, sometimes from minute to minute. That's an environment that I thrive in. I thrive in controlled chaos.
Yeah.
And so having the ability to flex across all the different areas that I do and participate in those and contribute to those is what is very passionate for me.
Okay, great. Well, Corey, thank you very much for your time. Very insightful. And we have it. Thanks.